So I decided to torture myself today and took a scroll through Figma and found this. I thought this would be simple, but as with everything CSS, nothing is predictable, and this took me way longer than I expected. I'm going to break this down into 3 main sections, starting with the static element. This part was simple. All we have are 3 elements here: the container, the text, and the arrow. I'll start off by setting the background color of the page. And now we can create our container and set the background color and the width and height to the values in the Figma file. And we'll just round off the corners real quick with the border radius. And now to add the text as a child element to the button and center it by turning it into a flex box and using align and justify content center. I'll set the font properties, firstly the font size, the font weight, and now the font family, but I'll need to also import the font from Google Fonts. I'm going to create the container that will hold the arrow icon and set the background color to this. I'll set the size and round the edges, and now I'm going to add the arrow icon into our container. I'll properly space the arrow and the text using the gap property, and here's the styled button, but it's static, not animated. Now let's make it more lively with some movement. The first animation is a hover animation. This one is pretty simple and consists of just these 2 frames. All that's changing is the button container gap. The animation will be triggered using a class, and the class will be added on the hover event using JavaScript. On the mouse over event, I'll add the hovered class to the button, and on the animation end event, I'll remove the class so it can be triggered on the next hover. I'm going to create a new rule set for when the button has a hover class, and in that, I'll be setting the animation. The duration will be set to 300 milliseconds, the animation name will be set, and the iteration count will be set to 1. Going back to the design, we can see the 2 frames in this animation, and in the second one, the elements are closer together. So I'll get the new value for the gap and change it at 25% and 75% of the way through the animation. But when we run the prototype, there's a slight bounce after they meet. So I'll add an intermediate step with a slightly wider gap and also add extra steps with the final width so that it's held longer. And there we have the working hover animation. Now it's time for the final part. Now we can break down the animation into 8 states. There's a start and the end state and 6 states in between. I took the delays from Figma, and this is how long each state lasts. The total animation length is 3100 milliseconds, but I'll use 3000 milliseconds so the steps can be set easily by using these percentages. And there are 5 different elements to animate: the button, the text, the arrow container, the arrow image, and the spinner itself. Each element will have its own animation. First, I'll add the JavaScript. Similar to what I did for the previous animation, I'll set the click class on the click event and remove it when the animation ends. This class will be used to trigger all 5 animations, so I'll add a rule set for the elements using the button click selector, and I'll set the animation duration to 3000 milliseconds, add the animation name, and set the iteration count to 1. But instead of repeating the duration 5 times, I'll set it in a CSS variable and reference it here. That way, the duration can be easily changed in one spot if needed. And now we keyframe. So the button animation is easy. I'm going to set the width to make it circular and the gap to 0 to remove the extra space. And I'll do this in state 1 and 6. I'll also set the cursor to pointer to signify that it can be clicked. For the text animation, we need the text to disappear off screen. And to do this, I'll set the opacity and the width to 0 in state 1 and 6. I'll also add these rules to the text object to keep it on one line. And I'll also set the default opacity and width in here. For the arrow container, I'll set the new height and width in stage 1 and 6. And we also need to center the image using a flex box. And for the arrow image, I'll use a translate X function with a transform property to move it out of the way. So on stage 2 and 6, I'll use translate X, and on stage 1, I'll set the height and width to match the parent, and I'll also set translate X to 0 so the movement doesn't start until stage 2. I'll also add overflow hidden to its parent so the arrow is not visible. And now for the spinner animation. There are 3 lines when the spinner is active: the internal white line, the green spinner line, and the external line. I'll start with the green line, the spinner. I'll create a before pseudo element on the arrow container, and I'll need to set the content to an empty string in order for the pseudo element to appear. I'll set the border radius to round the edges and use a conic gradient to cover just the bottom right corner of the element. I'll set the height and width, and I'll set Z index to -1 to place it behind, and I'll add position absolute for that to work. And finally, we'll add display inline block to allow animations to work. I'll also set the opacity to 0, but keep that out for now so I can see the element. Speaking of seeing, I'll also need to apply a Z index to the parent to fix the stacking order. Now I have the spinner showing, I can turn the opacity back off and add a border to the arrow container in order to create the internal white line. And there we have it. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn close. And that's it. Subscribe for more.